AERO board member, past. And today, I want to talk about the idea of thinking about a statewide umbrella that could advance community-based, value-based food systems in our state. And AERO has traditionally been focused on the community level. That is how we see creating resilient communities at that community level is how we've done our business for the last almost 5 decades. Working with individual communities, with individuals within that community that have a desire to advance their own world up and organize themselves to think about whether it's community energy or community food. There are other states in the nation that have taken this one step further and realized that there are necessary components at the statewide level that are needed for them to be able to advance beyond one community at a time. And so today, we want to just talk about some questions about that, and Hadley is going to take notes for me. And just we've had a few questions from our sessions yesterday to sort of start this conversation. Vermont is an example that I have seen with a very solid farm-to-plate program. And they based a lot of their initiative on things that were happening in their state when their dairy industry failed. And the need for more support to recreate their food systems in that state. So that was sort of their impetus. They have gone on though, and they very much tied their food system work to economics. And it has gained great momentum as a result. They have found a lot of unique ways to have a quasi-government group that's supported by the government, but at the same time supported by their communities and the people within their communities and nonprofits. You know, they pay their steering committees to go to meetings. They have some power within the legislature. So there are some variety of values in thinking about, is this something that Montana should pursue? In my personal opinion, as I've been involved in this work for the last decade or so, what I often see is that our own Grow Montana, which I think was a very effective policy level organization, we had great impact in creating programs that were at the statewide level, but then filtered down to our communities. So I'm hoping that's enough sort of a background of where I want to go with this conversation this morning. And anybody want to add anything before I get started? You know, Bonnie's in the room. Anything anyone would want to just pitch in about this idea of considering creating a statewide food plan, a food system plan?
No, I'm interested in hearing what you have to say. Then I'll chime in.
Okay.
I like the idea.
So the questions that we sort of saw yesterday that came up during our discussions with a variety of the sessions, just the idea of talking about a statewide food system plan and what the pros and cons might be of that for the state of Montana. What would be the value of that from your perspective, and who should that touch, and ideas how that might get started. So let's just talk briefly about, have I given you enough background about what a statewide food system plan might look like? Or have you heard of them from other states? I think New Mexico has one, potentially Michigan, Vermont, either Wisconsin or Minnesota. And when I read about them, I see value in how it's moved community-based food systems to another level. So let's just chat about that, what folks think. Anybody want to start?
I guess I think that when you think about the size of Vermont, it's much more doable than the state of Montana. I think one of the biggest challenges that we have is that we are huge and we don't have a lot of urban centers or large markets. And so I think it has to be uniquely Montana.
Yes.
And to really think about what the rural impact is and how to engage the real rural areas. I think having, much like the climate, the statewide climate plan that's happening right now, if we can kind of think about how kind of use that model more maybe than somewhere else. Not that, I mean, I've looked at Vermont as well, and certainly they have some policies that really are working and are regulating how growth happens and how ag is developed, and I think that that's important as well. But I think maybe looking at other sectors might help inform what a statewide plan would look like.
Sectors as in
The
climate plan.
Yeah.
Yep, yep. And New Mexico, which I've not done enough homework on, which is a little bit more like us, they do have an existing statewide food plan, and I think it has benefited to some degree how they've been able to move some of these initiatives forward. If we, some of the things that we talked about yesterday, some of the things that what we know, like Bonnie says, we're concentrated producers in Western Montana. There are many areas that are not conducive in this state for growing produce of their food deserts. There's interest in some regions that have interest in a local food system but may not have knowledgeable producers. There's institutions that are still struggling with calories versus local and healthy. Short growing seasons, hotter, drier. We talked a lot about labeling yesterday, and what we call this. Is it local? Is it regional? Is it community-based? Is it value-based? The slogan that came up yesterday was putting more Montana food on Montana plates, which I kind of loved. Yet we also talked about the fact that because of our food systems are so concentrated in these urban areas, there's a lot of people that are just trying to get food on the table. And that whole concept where we can increase the value of food systems in communities, that idea of educating an entire state of 1 million people in the 4th largest state in the country is a challenge. And you can't, in my personal opinion, I don't think you can do that as a community at a time. I think those messages that are broader, that can help people begin to understand why it might be worth paying 50 cents more for something that is locally, grown. And again, the word local was another discussion we had yesterday. If you were in any of those sessions, there have been very arbitrary boundaries put on in some states, and in our state too, where it's got to be 50 miles from my grower or I'm not going to sell it, or it's 100. I mean, there's all kinds of 450 miles. There's a lot of these, if you're not in, you're out. And those sorts of concepts in our state, as Bonnie said, with these very concentrated areas of where we can grow this type of food, really restricts us then from potentially moving forward community at a time. So there are definitely a lot of challenges in this state with the fact of our unique size and demographics that we have. It still very much feels like local food is still a very elitist thing, as Kate talked about a lot as we organized this in Bozeman. Right. That it's still, after yesterday, I can still honestly say it is still very much for people with discretionary income.
The elephant in the room of the finances of it tends to have certain people move it that way, and I think that's what Open and Local and many others are fighting against, is that stereotype of whatever your word is, whether it's local or sustainable or blah, 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 that there's a premium for that, which you hear QFD talk about, and that's a foundational buyer in our system that is valuable to our local entrepreneurs. But we need to find a way to crack that open so that's not the only place. And I remember watching the farm to school or farm to market class presentations, and it felt like it was an interesting mix of taking a product from a farm that was a waste product or a new something, a diversification of income, but the marketing was to make it pay was all to the high end. Mm-hmm. And so just trying to diversify how people are thinking about that, I think is pretty critical. And commenting to something you said earlier about we can't get to every single community, we need a statewide message. We have to get to every community because this is how this work happens. It's from the bottom up, it's from the people. And if you have some message coming from the outside, it doesn't work. So it's, you know, I do think a slogan like Montana food for Montana plates is pretty powerful, but then what does that look like on this community and helping them think more broadly about food and just really, we have been powered, and the reason why this country is as powerful as it is, as we heard yesterday from a different angle, is because we have cheap food, and so we didn't have to think about it. We could focus on like developing computers and all sorts of other stuff in our military. Anyway, taking it back to building a statewide food plan, the thought that I've had when it's come up is like, awesome, like totally drawn to it like a moth, like a good liberal progressive. But that we need to slow down and be like, well, what are the pathways? What's the ground that needs to be laid before we can even get to the conversation of statewide food plan? Because if you walk into a small community and say, we need a statewide food plan, they're gonna be like, get the hell out of here. And I'm overreacting and I'm exaggerating and stereotyping, but when I think about, okay, what are the pathways? The work that AERO is doing, trying to go into communities and say, what can we do to help you strengthen? You're building that network that will become eventually ripe to go there. They're thinking about the food system. They're not just thinking about sustainable ag. They're thinking about the food system. Another pathway is there's already a lot of energy and momentum behind a statewide climate plan. Why don't we have a food piece to that? And that's a gateway as well. So let's not try to go for gold right now. Let's lay the groundwork and form a strategy that gets us there and figure out how different entities in this room, NCAT, CFAC, everybody else, MOA, fit into that.
And those are great things, and I would also add to that though, we've had 2 governor-led, inspired food and ag summits. And that to me says a lot that there has been support I'm with the government and I can help, but at the same time, there may be aspects of this, as much as you want to walk into a community, Ekalaka or Malta. I mean, our experience in Malta was very compelling to show us that you may go into a community that you might have one person in that community that values locally grown food, yet at the same time, the missing component was that the rest of the community has no understanding or value of that. Great Falls is another example where we initially had an NFEI site there. We had a lot of support from some producers that were there, and at the same time they had experienced the same thing. Their local community does not value organic probably or local in the big enough way that they were able to begin to find the capital to move some of these concepts forward. So I guess me being in state government for 32 years, you know, I'll just be the advocate here that I see value oftentimes in having that other layer. I don't know personally how we would get to this educational piece that is needed for us to begin that first step in a community. If you have information that comes from somewhere else that is all over the state, I mean, when you look at Commerce yesterday talking about the fact that they need to figure out how to message better and work with more people first before they start a taste of place or another one of their slogans. Joy was very, very clear on, Susan Joy was very clear on, we didn't do our homework on this one. So those partnerships with state government agencies, nonprofits around the state with membership, I guess I'm just throwing that out there can there be found some value in could this elevate and expand our abilities to create more community-based open food systems?
I'm gonna jump in here.
Sure.
One.
This is Jody from Expo.
Sorry, Jamie from.
Let's introduce ourselves so poor Hadley can figure out, like, who said that?
Jamie Lockman from Montana Organic Association. And I'm gonna put on my Eastern Montana hat for a second and say, you know, that there's a lot of the informal part of the food and ag economy that happens in Eastern Montana, that when messaging from Western Montana comes, it's just shut down.
Huh.
Yeah, it seems very top down, even though, you know, I know the approach is trying to be bottom up. And so it's, you know, tribal communities, Hutterite communities. I know of some great work that's happening in Poplar with a garden group, garden club. That's amazing to me. I think there's also some knowledge that those communities have as far as food processing, because they, you know, they're still the grandmas that can and put up every single year, and some of their grandkids know how to do that. So that's part of it. I guess I would say, you know, maybe start with an assessment even at the local level to find out what resources are there. Second, I do think that food should be part of the climate plan. However, I think that still shuts down a lot of people, unfortunately. So I think it can be a part, but maybe some arm's length from something that's done.
Good point. Yeah. Can you say your name?
Oh, yep. So I'm Kay Matsunami. I'm from NCAT, National Center for Appropriate Technology over in Butte. And I just want to echo, you know, some of the points being made about, you know, I really agree that ultimately the impetus for a community to participate in the statewide food plan has to come from them and what makes sense for them. At the same time, I do really see a lot of appeal in there being a statewide food plan, and that narrative that is kind of co-created by all these different communities and these state level entities and organizations and agencies, just because, you know, like Jamie was saying, with these communities, there's, you know, the idea of like resiliency and community resiliency came up a lot yesterday during my conversations, and I think that communities along the High Line in Eastern Montana specifically, I mean, I'm coming from the farm to institution, like farm to school world, that they really want to come up with a plan based on their town specifically, as opposed to, you know, looking to resources outside of that town. And it makes sense, you know, if you think about farm to school, and, you know, if a school in Malta would want to create a farm to cafeteria program rather than look at opportunities having to do with, you know, distribution routes and all of that outside of that community, that's just a pain, you know. And there's this sort of feeling that those distributors don't really care a lot about us by the time those trucks come here, and the local produce that is available is almost perishable by that point. It's not really looking too good, so we'll just grow our own food. And so there's this strong idea of resilience at that very local level, to really see them as Malta and to see themselves as, you know, Browning. But there are all these opportunities that can be, you know, if we collaborate and coordinate, and if there's a good, you know, narrative and message about there not being any divisiveness in a statewide food plan and us being able to exchange resources and coordinate. I mean, Amelia and I were just like talking this morning about like those distribution routes and all those trucks that are moving all around the state and have, you know, all this empty truck space. And there's just so much opportunity that I feel like we can only get to from this statewide level, and to be able to really coordinate with multiple different folks. And I think ultimately the reason why we'd want to do that is to support these, you know, local communities in these rural areas. So it's really like a two-way street and meeting halfway. But I really do see the benefit in there being a statewide food plan, but also really keeping in mind, you know, the mentality in a lot of these rural communities and making sure that it makes sense to them, and that the impetus comes from, you know, their years and years of understanding their food system and what works and what they need.
Absolutely, and that was never intended to suggest that one size fits all.
Oh yeah.
Only that is there value in creating some level of support in some variety of areas that would enhance the ability for folks in their own community to move their own local food system forward. And that may include, we can't grow anything here. We can do backyard gardens, but we need support from other places in the state that can grow. A couple more comments, and we've got 2 more questions we want to kind of talk about a little bit about today. This is a great conversation. Thank you. And Kate, I'm not sure you said your name to begin with. Maybe Hadley knows who you are.
Hi, Kate Wright. This is just a small piece because I do find semantics matter a lot and how you speak in different regions. That maybe if AERO is going to continue to think about this, or anyone in the room, we're talking about a statewide food initiative, not a plan. Because plan just feels like we are planning on you. Whereas if you have an initiative, it's like we want to come to your community and figure out how to help support what you have going on. Because the people in Malta were totally psyched for outside resources and they want to do it, but they're struggling with capacity. There's so many things that a limited number of movers and shakers are trying to move forward. And so it's that long-term relationship in those communities and nurturing that and not abandoning, like, oh, that didn't work, so let's go somewhere else. No,
Exactly.
no.
Exactly.
So that's it pulling from the whole field of organizing, relationship building, and that's a lot of what Robin and Jen so beautifully put up there, all the mycelia under the soil. Like, we are all connected. So just a thought that maybe even just talking about it casually as an initiative rather than a plan might be helpful.
Yeah. Steve?
Steve Thompson, Executive Director of National Center for Appropriate Technology. And a couple things I wanted to add to the conversation. I'd like a show of hands. How many people know that the state is working on a Montana Resiliency Framework? So that's because they've been keeping it really secret. In fact, it may be, it may have been headed toward a death. Until recently, I'm sort of forcing it into the Climate Solutions Council, and it's happening right now. But this is, in 2018, the Department of Commerce held community conversations, listening sessions in 19 communities, 18, 19 communities around the state under the name Montana Ready Communities Initiative. And so you've heard of that.
I've heard it's with the governor's office.
It's through the Department of Commerce.
Okay.
Supposedly multi-agency, with the idea that this would lead to the development of a Montana Resiliency Framework. If you go on the website of Department of Commerce, Montana Ready Communities Initiative, you can read about it. They talk specifically as analogs, the Colorado Resiliency Framework and one in Vermont. And we've been trying to engage them as part of this Climate Smart Montana network of communities working on local climate solutions, looking for potential support. And we sort of got shut down with Commerce a few months ago. But now that I'm on the Governor's Council, I'm forcing the issue. And I think Commerce has changed its tune now. And are basically saying we're going to own this, we're going to re-own it. I don't think they were actually, I don't know what was going to happen with the resiliency framework, but it was not moving forward. It was way behind the schedule. They weren't returning my messages recently, but now that I've got more of a perch on the council, I think it's going to come to the forefront, which is a good thing. And basically the idea is, climate would be a portion of it, but it would be just more broadly resilience. And so the question is, what's the state's role in supporting communities? So it's not one size fits all, but basically so that communities aren't trying to figure it out all on their own, and there's some capacity support, some strategic support, maybe some resources from the state level. And so that's one thing that I want people to know about. And if you have any feedback on that, because I'm pushing that, I'm riding that horse pretty strong right now, and hoping to make that one of the tangible things that come out of this, that we do have a state resiliency framework that supports communities, and it definitely has a climate angle, but is broader than that, and just ties in with this, like you say, Kay, a lot of discussion about resilience. I think that's the best frame to be addressing these issues. Second thing I want to mention is that right now NCAT, we're working on a we're in discussions with the a foundation in Austin on an initiative that we're calling 10 Cents Texas, and a few other states have something like this. That is, the idea is that this foundation would provide an extra 10 cents per meal for schools. I think schools is the place that, I mean, that's where we get the education, that's where we start to institutionalize it. That's where we can have appropriate scales to do some of this, you know, like the work Kay's doing in Malta and Browning and Fort Benton, the farm to institution. I mean, I think that's the place to go. This foundation is looking to create a good model in Austin, which of course is a huge school district, to put an extra 10 cents per meal to support Texas produce and Texas products coming into the schools. With the idea, their strategic goal is to get the state to embrace that statewide, so that there's actually state funding to support local producers getting food into an institution. That's an initiative that apparently is happening to some extent in other states. I think we have the potential to do that here between the Town Pump Foundation and the Washington Foundation. This might be something that would appeal to them. And I don't know if those conversations have already started or they're doing things along those lines, but both of them are interested in food. They're also interested in economic development and made in Montana type of strategies.
That leads perfectly into two other topics that I want to make sure we address this morning. We've got a half an hour left. One is the fact that these nonprofits and state government agencies that are doing great things. Two things. We've had a statewide policy council, Grow Montana, which is currently basically defunct. And we also, one of the strongest action items requested by the Governor's Food and Ag Summit of 2016 was to create a statewide food council. And so when I'm talking about statewide, you know, a plan, an initiative, but there are other components of this, even if we don't go all the way. But one of the biggest things I see as being involved with AERO for the last 6 years pretty closely is that we've lost this communication between these organizations that are all doing really good work. And you know, there's, sure, we might go in on a grant here and there, but our overall efforts and where we are and what we're doing, in my opinion, we have lost a lot by no longer being able to support Grow Montana. And I do want to take some time, this is a little bit of a segue, two things I want to make sure we talk about is that, and there's going to be a later session on Grow Montana specifically, which I guess, I don't know if that's not going to be well attended at that point. I think we should broach that subject now. But I think this is a critical step to continue these conversations and make sure that all of these organizations and state government organizations that are working towards creating more food, Montana food on Montana plates, that we know what each others are doing. And with that said, that entity also was our policy and lobbying and legislative arm, that a lot of nonprofits can't spend a lot of time doing that. So I guess I'm open up to talking about that now, talking about those two things. One, the value of a statewide food council. Is that a reinvention of Grow Montana? Does that look different? Is it an arm, Bruce or Steve, of maybe the climate action group? Also knowing that when a governor changes, which is going to happen in 2020, some of these initiatives may be gone. So how hard we tie something that means a lot to us, even if we want that state level need and realize that, do we then in fact tie ourselves to that group, which, you know, I'm glad Bullock did it now. Was it partly because he's running for president? I mean, you know, I wanted to be a cynical, pessimistic person. But I just like to open that conversation up about those two things. One, the value of having this statewide food council. I know we've tried, and I think that was maybe Schweitzer put one into place after he did the Food and Ag Summit in 2006, and it didn't last. Another topic that came up yesterday was a growers association across the state. You know, it's a matter of time and energy and money, which always seems to be the biggest factors that stop us from doing some of these things. But I've rolled around the idea of continuing the state council, which I looked at Vermont, you know, they pay those people that are on that council to be there, to show up. You know, I think that's in part what's happened to Grow Montana, that maybe when we were all a little flusher, we were able to send our folks to these things on a volunteer basis and pay out of our discretionary funds that maybe we don't have as much of anymore. Sharing that, you know, is a big burden that comes from somebody that's probably working in one of these groups. So I'd like to open up that idea of a statewide food council, reinventing Grow Montana. I just feel personally extremely strongly, I don't have an AERO hat anymore. I just feel this is really important that we find a communication mechanism in this state that all of us know what each other are doing, and that we can support each other initiatives or collaborate and not compete. So I'll open that discussion up right now.
I'm John Brown. I'm a nomad living currently up north of Billings Ranch, and one of the founding AERO board members. And I'm the chair of the Northern Plains Soil Task Force. And in the process of looking at healthy soil, it was last year, a year before, and AERO was part of that, One Montana had capacity to work on what they're calling a healthy soil converging, or soil health converging, which was a collection of lots of different NGOs, government organizations, all kinds of organizations, all having a common interest in soil health in some way or another. They changed their capacity. Now there's nobody working on that collaboration potential. And I think that that's one of the really what you're, you know, how do we move from all of these organizations in Montana competing with one another for limited resource, limited capacity, and merge into a collaborative of function. And, you know, if it is a food policy or initiative or whatever it is, if it's a climate initiative, that we have to, in my opinion, in order to bridge this gap that we are facing as a species, learn to work together and share resources. And it might be that AERO then, like, you know, just reverses the process of its origin, going from an affiliate of Northern Plains Resource Council then to its own organization, to merging with the other and giving up, releasing our proprietary force of an individual organization into being part of another or other collaborative of organizations, and losing, just like it's the Grow Montana. These are artificial borders that have been established, and trying to force our policies into borders that have nothing to do with geology, geography, with human stuff. So, you know, maybe the Montana Watershed Coalition is something to look at. If we're looking at, you know, how does a watershed feed itself? You know, rather than how does east of the mountains or west of the mountains, or, you know, Kalispell, or, you know, there's, you know, I don't have any answers. I'm just, you know, what are the questions that we need to be asking around the ability to be resilient and self-sufficient in the world of food.
And, you know, a lot of time, well said about that, because a lot of times we're able to support something, these initiatives come and go because we don't have a stable set of income for some level of absolute priority, you know.
You know, we're looking at the income level, but you mentioned sharing resources too, you know, having just revamped a whole lot with MOA. It'd be great to be sharing some software and things, and a bookkeeper. I mean, I'd love to have a bookkeeper.
Yep.
But I need a bookkeeper like for 45 minutes
There
a
you
month.
go.
You know, so, but
These
it would,
are all good
but I
things.
can't do it. We have a board member who's taking care of it, but that's, you know, it's a lot for her too. She's got a lot going on. So, you know, looking at those sorts of things, and we're talking about fundraising, and these are just like basic little things, but it's the customer relationship databases. You know, I think that we probably all have a different system, but we could probably get a license and share it among us.
There you go. I mean, these are little tiny details, and they're not tiny, but these are
When you're on a
significant
really thin
details.
margin, you know, so
That's
now,
right.
and it would make me be more efficient to have a better system. So,
Other thoughts about a council idea? And it's not new. I mean, Grow Montana is wonderful, and you guys put together such an awesome video for that funding that unfortunately we did not get. That is online, you guys. If you want to go to Grow Montana and just feel people talk about, you know, this idea of what the value is of this council, go to NCAT's website, and it's right there.
Tom Cheetah from, I guess, the Yellowstone Valley Food Hub. Is it a little bit a matter of focus? Because I actually didn't know what Grow Montana was doing, but is it, none of us here were talking about how much food we could ship out of state. And was Grow Montana a bigger picture, like economy of all the agriculture in the state versus focusing more on local, selling local, distributing local? Is that what you're picturing with a statewide food council, is focusing more on the local scene versus, I think the state government is going to want to focus on the big ag picture and how much can we sell to Japan and everything, where that's not really what we're talking about, right?
I think it's been around, Steve, for what, maybe 20?
Close to 20 years, is my understanding.
For 2 decades, there we go. Grow Montana has advocated for changes in policies to strengthen Montana's food and agricultural economies. The coalition has led systems research, produced education materials, and stewarded significant policy changes to support Montana's food producers, processors, distributors, and consumers. So it was our policy arm of being able to move things forward that we couldn't do at the community level, at our own non-profit level, at that lobbying level. So it was very, in its heyday, extremely powerful. And a very, in my opinion, a very necessary piece of what we're missing with respect to all of the conversation we had yesterday about processing, for instance, in the state. The cottage food bill, you know, Nancy Matheson touched on, yet at the same time, which was great in 2015, it didn't go nearly far enough. It was a great first step, but we basically lost the capacity of Grow Montana for the next 2 legislative sessions, and were unable to assess what needed to be done to the cottage food bill, the Modernization Act, and then move that back into the legislation to do more and to get more value added, all the things that they struck out, put back in and move that forward. So there's no question, you know, I'm never going to say that we don't need legislation. I mean, that's how things get done, right? And that's, to me, the value of a council reinvigorating Grow Montana. Is it a membership dues we need to come up with so we can create some sustainable funding? I mean, that's the key here, you guys, is that we just, all of us, we have this. We get a grant, we can go do good work, we lose the grant, we lose capacity, done. We, you know, have to shift focus because we got a new grantor, we get another grant, we do some good work, we lose that funding. And so it's this long-term sustainability. And in Grow Montana, you know, I'm pitching that we do consider looking at its membership, looking at how we fund it. I mean, that you are, if you're a part of it, the benefit, you know, $500 a year, $1,000 a year, the organization is going to pay, and we're going to continue to pay that, and that's going to be a line item in our budgets. So,
That is how Grow Montana was funded
Okay.
initially. And
Thank you,
was
Bonnie.
really just policy oriented and the research to back it up. So there would be research projects followed by specific 1 or 2 policy pieces at the legislature, and a lobbyist, and not just a lobbyist, but the organizations that were part of Grow Montana then would organize within their communities and send producers and distributors and relevant people to the legislature so that it wasn't just the lobbyist. And the lobbyist would communicate back with us and say, this is gonna come up before the committee on Friday, I need 5 people there to speak to this specific thing.
Cool.
And then we would make sure from our community that that was there. And we paid dues. So
Okay.
each organization had to pay a certain amount to be a part of it.
Okay.
And really, when when it was most active, there were probably 6 to 8 organizations, and they were all paying between $250 and $500 to hire that lobbyist and then be very supportive within the community.
so in your
that's the
opinion, what
issue.
happened?
Organizations changed.
Uh-huh.
Leadership changed within those organizations. Some people retired and moved away. And there wasn't new momentum to replace them.
Okay.
That's what I feel. Tried to keep some momentum going, both mostly AERO, I would say, sort of tried to be that organizing piece, and really it's not one organization that needs to take it on. It's that there needs to be a group from across the state, not just in certain areas, but from across the state that really are dedicated to making it happen. And that's what really was it was a group of people that were very committed to each other and to the legislative piece.
I know, it's maintaining the momentum, whether people retire or funding goes away, that we really need to try to address here, I think. There will be another session, but I don't know how many people are staying around to maybe get some real concrete ideas about what this looks like. I'd like Neva in the room if that's possible, if she's still going to be around, because
She has already left.
She's already left, okay.
She was one of
Because
the original.
that food and ag summit, I think there were 5 or 6 different tracks, and I think 4 of those tracks said, we need this council. And I know that we wanted to do that after that was over, and I know we tried to do it again through grant funding, and we didn't get the grant. So these are those fits and starts here, folks, that we got to deal with. We just can't keep putting all this energy into these things that we just can't continue because of financial momentum is what I think it really boils down to, and consistency. With that said, last 15 minutes, let's talk about legislation. The need for it, people can identify right now pieces that they know they need. I'll throw in, I know we need more on the Modernization Act, the Cottage Food Bill. We definitely struck out a lot of that. I know that that's one thing. I know meat processing seems to be something, and I don't know where legislation is part of that or not, but it certainly appears, I don't know if Tom can speak to that, but maybe there's other things as well that folks want to just throw out there as a brainstorming session, since we don't have a session coming up in Montana for we've got a year here to think about legislation and how that's going to be, what is needed and who's going to help. I'm not even asking for that, but just what do we need in this state right now to move forward value-based, community-based food systems, or distribution, processing for our producers, for our waste recovery, and for our consumers.
What impresses me most about what they're doing and what Thunder Valley Community Development Corporation in the Pine Ridge Reservation is doing is that they're modeling sovereignty. They have said, we're not going to wait for anyone else to give us our sovereignty. We're claiming it, and we're acting on it. And I think that in some ways that that is relevant to what we're doing, in that we're wanting someone else, or wanting to get permission from funders or whoever it is, or policymakers or policy breakers, to be our authority for doing what we want to do. And in local communities, the local is looking for the state to do something that will support us, and it's just like, you know, let's like in Thunder Valley, a group of young people were sitting around and saying, you know, we're not accepting the plan that is laid out for us of being, you know, 60% or 70% unemployed, and in disastrous economic, social, political status. We're going to do something different. We don't know what, but we're going to do something different, and it's up to us to do it. And they have done it, and are creating a model for community development that's fantastic, and are happy to share it. And that's, you know, what the Blackfeet are doing as well. And can we learn from what they're modeling for us?
I'd add to that, in conversations with Lauren, have learned more about what they're trying to do, and it's I think it has a significant potential for Montana to engage with them, and because of their sovereign status, that they can do some things. Some really significant things that aren't local food systems, but could certainly benefit local food systems, because, I mean, they're looking at international markets. They don't, as I understand it, they can define themselves as not having to pertain to particular export laws, etc. NAFTA means nothing to them, for example. They are searching markets as though they are a sovereign nation, which they could easily become a funnel for lots of Montana products. And I'm not just talking about commodities. I think it could be a whole range of things. So it's certainly worth that discussion, and making sure that we're close to that. I know Steve and I are on a committee to look at feasibility of a meat processing plant on the reservation in Browning, and just exactly what that does for really something broader than just the reservation. This is really looking at how supply could be funneled through that with added value, and then shipped to the world, basically. It's really exciting potential that I think that yeah, as we expand that and start to think about, we have 7 reservations really nicely distributed around the state that could really be the central point for so much of how we start to think maybe more broadly about our food and moving our food, and really using those, the marketing vision I think that they have, and working with that, and thinking about how our networks feed into that. And perhaps can be creatively thinking about that idea. And I really like your idea, John, about how that's really what we want to model back into our more local kind of system. But I think that has great potential.
What's the organizational structure that you two are working on that together?
So we, NCAT has the contract with the Blackfeet Nation to co-produce this feasibility study, and it has funding through the Keep Siegel Settlement Fund, which is a huge resource right now.
Keep Siegel?
Yeah. The Keep Siegel Settlement Fund is part of the USDA settlement of a class action lawsuit with Indian country, and a small chunk of that was distributed to individual farmers and ranchers. A parallel one was the Pigford settlement with African Americans. Most of that went out to individual producers. Keep Siegel, most of it did not go to individual producers. I don't think they filed claims by and large. And so now there was a small fast track granting opportunity through the First Nations Development Institute, which the Blackfeet got $40,000 to initiate this feasibility study. And now the big chunk has just become available through the Native American Agriculture Fund. There's over $250 million that'll be distributed over the next 10 years for Indian country agriculture and food systems. But yeah, this is like an economic analysis, looking at markets, looking at livestock, looking at production systems. I'll be honest with you, it's going to be a tough haul for this to be a feasible project. You got ranchers that are producing either cow-calf operations. They're selling, and the livestock is moving east. To maintain a year-round meat processing plant on the Blackfeet Reservation, it's going to require a lot of pieces to come together, and so we're trying to identify what those pieces are. So that's a nutshell on that one. But to tie in with what John and Bruce are saying, we've also this Native American Agriculture Fund just closed an RFP that we ended up putting in a proposal to primarily through contractors, Linda Howard and Mariah Gladstone, who have been very involved in food sovereignty issues already in Montana. We'd be contracting with them to really engage with all 7 reservations and look at what's going on with food sovereignty, what the best practices are, start to network the nations. The one thing that really was not part of that proposal, but got me thinking, is rather than just sort of coalesce and to create a network and share best practices across Indian country, is to actually share those ideas outside of Indian country. So I think there's some real potential there. I think an important part of what the Blackfeet are doing that is broadly applicable in terms of framing and in terms of what their true interest is, and the whole notion of food sovereignty is the health angle. That local food is healthy, and culturally appropriate food is a way of addressing social problems. And I think that's not just true in Indian country. It's very pronounced in Indian country, but I think it's true more broadly. And it also is as a source of pride and as a basis for social cohesion and ultimately resilience.
To recreate this communication network at a minimum and move so we can stay in touch with each other. I mean, I've never heard of any of these things, and I thought I knew something, but obviously, I mean, it's very impressive what's going on, that when you get in your own little world here, how we stay connected and help each other move things forward in a collaborative way and share each other's resources. Any other legislation ideas? We're just about at the time limit here. Any other thoughts as far as bottlenecks, roadblocks you see that legislation could potentially help us?
And I know some of you were there yesterday in the session about in our big moving forward discussion at the end of yesterday about where we broke into different sections to talk about the local food system and identify gaps and how those different pillars of the food system can support each other. And we found that processing was a major gap because nobody was there to talk about it. But one of the pieces of legislation that my small group and I discussed was the power of institutions and I know we've talked about this at different parts of the conference, but if there was a piece of legislation that could encourage or incentivize institutions like schools and hospitals and other places of community to reduce waste and to collect food waste and kind of close that cycle of the food system, Kay was talking about with transportation, and there's a big logistical piece that I can't wrap my brain around, and I hope I find someone who can. Using technology to figure out the most efficient way to close that cycle. And I think legislation could play a really key piece in incentivizing not necessarily like punishing organizations for not doing or not participating in helping that cycle move more smoothly between producer and waste recovery, and in between. And so we didn't really come to any answers except that maybe institutions are kind of a key place to engage most community and educate people.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I know double SNAP almost passed this last legislative section. And then the 10-cent Texas made me think about the farm to school bill that just needed more momentum behind it. And so I think there's a number of bills that if Grow Montana or whatever replaces it comes together, maybe this conversation will happen again.
Double SNAP in what, Kate? I missed the second.
There was a farm to school funding bill as well.
Okay.
To bring money into institutions to help support those programs and supplement the difference in cost.
Okay.
And there are a couple groups that are working on those.
Right.
And did have a lot of momentum and a lot of voice in the state legislation that really was kind of surprising that double SNAP got as far as it did.
It was
quite
awesome.
honestly,
Oh
because
my
there
gosh.
was so much.
What's his
And-
name from Kalispell just walked in that and just destroyed it. I was there at the hearing. It was awful. Who are the two organizations? Fine.
It's a statewide PEC, which stands for something.
Yeah, Partnership to End Childhood Hunger.
Yeah.
Okay, gotcha. Know that one.
And
Partnership to.
the Montana Food Bank Network
Okay.
was a big part of that as well.
Cool.
But there is a network that, CPAC was a part of it also.
Yes, yes, I know Kim's
And
really.
a rather large group in Missoula. So I anticipate that that will be back and that it will actually pass this next year. But I think that really specific, concrete things like that are what are needed, and that we need to have that communication piece, and maybe that's as much a role for AERO as anyone else, because of the community outreach that AERO has done, is to really have more say at the legislative level from places, not Western Montana,
Gotcha, gotcha.
from
Cool.
across the state, that often have more power than we do.
Cool. Hey, this was very informative, in my opinion. And I think there's a lot of good food for thought here. No longer being an AERO board member, maybe I've got some time to refocus on a few of my other passions here. But thank you all.